This is part 17, and as we have discussed up to section 81 of the Negotiable Instrument Act, in this part we start with chapter 7, and to understand chapter 7, which deals with discharge from liability on notes, bills and checks, we start discussing right from section 82 up to section 90 of this enactment. Now, what do you mean by discharge from liability? Negotiable instrument is drawn in order to carry out payment with respect to the negotiable instrument for which it is drawn, and hence when that purpose has been served, or when the liability of the party comes to an end, which are the different ways with which we shall be dealing during course of our discussion, no doubt about it. But for example, if in case of a promissory note, or in case of a bill of exchange, or in case of a check, the party gets payment with respect to the same, naturally, that is, all parties are discharged, that is, the maker, or as you start, or the acceptor, or the endorser respectively of a negotiable instrument, it discharged from the liability. And hence section 82, heading of the section is discharge from liability, and it starts with the wording, the maker, acceptor or endorser respectively of a negotiable instrument, it discharged from liability thereon. And this section lays down three ways in which a party is discharged from the liability. And then, instead of starting with small a, the time for me to start with small c. And what is that? Parties are discharged from liability by payment. And then if you read small c, it says, to all parties thereto, if the instrument is payable to bearer or has been endorsed in blank, and such maker, acceptor or endorser makes payment in due course of the amount due thereon. In other words, when the payment is carried out in due course, then naturally that is discharge of the parties as far as the negotiable instrument is concerned. And just to refresh your memory, what do you mean by payment in due course? If you refresh your memory by referring to section 10, which says payment in due course means payment in accordance with the apparent tenor of the instrument in good faith and without negligence to any person in possession thereof under circumstances which do not afford a reasonable ground for believing that he is not entitled to receive the payment of the amount therein mentioned. So if the payment is carried out in due course, then naturally the parties are discharged from liability as far as small c of section 82 is concerned. The next way, small a, deals by what do you mean by cancellation, and it says the maker, acceptor or endorser respectively of a negotiable instrument is discharged from liability. So I mean, this is a time you have needless for me to repeat that maker in case of a promissory note, liability of the acceptor starts who before he accepts was a drawee, and once he has accepted the bill of exchange, he becomes what is known as an acceptor or endorser. And then this will be again, I mean, point for me to draw your attention that the party, the subsequent, I mean, if you think about right of intermediate party, then that party has got right to recover the amount from prior party, whereas the party is liable to the subsequent party that we have discussed so far. So the liability will come to an end by cancellation. And it says, to a holder thereof who cancels such acceptor's or endorser's name with intent to discharge him and all parties claiming under such holder. So now what is done by him? There is intentional, there is cancellation performed to a holder who cancels such acceptor or endorser's name. So if the holder has cancelled acceptor's name, or if the holder cancels endorser's name, naturally that is because of the cancellation of the name, liability in case of acceptor, liability of all parties will come to an end. Whereas in case of endorser's name, then naturally to all parties claiming under such title. So this is, the subsequent parties are discharged from liability, because as you have, what is the right of the subsequent party? To recover from the endorser. As in case, if you remember, A draws a negotiable instrument in favor of Mr. B, and that is put into circulation to Mr. C, to Mr. D, to Mr. E, to Mr. F, and to Mr. G. Now, what is if the name of Mr. D is cancelled, the subsequent parties have got right to recover amount. So E has got right, F has got right, and G has got right to recover amount from Mr. D. So if a holder has cancelled the name of Mr. D, these subsequent parties are also discharged from liability. And if he has cancelled the name of the acceptor, naturally, who is supposed to carry out payment? It is the acceptor who is supposed to carry out the payment. The parties have got right to recover that amount from the acceptor, and if the acceptor's name is cancelled, then naturally liability of all parties with respect to the negotiable instrument will come to an end, and that is what is known as by cancellation. The third way dealt by subclause small b is it says by release, and it says to a holder thereof who otherwise discharges such maker, acceptor or endorser, and to all parties deriving title under such holder after due notice of such discharge. Now, nothing is mentioned as far as the instrument, negotiable instrument is concerned, but here the person has there is an agreement, and as per the agreement he has released the party. So if he has, that is, he has waived, in other words, he has waived his right to proceed against the party is discharged from the liability. Now, who are the parties who are discharged as far as the release is concerned? Namely, the party whose name is mentioned as far as the agreement is concerned. And to all parties, in that case, for example, if he has released one party, to all parties deriving title under such holder after due notice of such discharge. So, due notice of discharge is given, then naturally when the party deriving title under such holder, the same principle is applicable. If D is released from liability, the subsequent parties have got right to recover amount from Mr. D, and hence by releasing Mr. D, the subsequent parties are also discharged from liability by release as far as section 82 is concerned. So section 82, as for when the liability of the parties will come to an end, by cancellation, 2 by release, and by payment are the aspects or the ways that are enumerated as far as section 82 is concerned. With this now, this is also the time for me to draw your attention to maybe some of the sections with which you are dealt in past. For example, this is the time for me to draw your attention to section 36, and section 36 deals with what? It deals with liability of endorser, and it says, in the absence of a contract to the contrary, whoever endorses and delivers a negotiable instrument before maturity without in such endorsement expressly excluding or making conditional his own liability is bound thereon to every subsequent holder, in case of dishonor by the drawee, acceptor or maker, to compensate such holder for any loss or damage caused to him by such dishonor, provided due notice of dishonor has been given to or received by such endorser as hereinafter provided. Every endorser after dishonor is liable as upon an instrument payable on demand. This is, I mean, as when we were discussing provisions regarding endorser, then there, I mean, that is if it is an order instrument, in order to put it into circulation, there must be an endorsement and then delivery of the instrument accordingly. So this is also, this deals with the, when the liability, this is liability of endorser as far as section 35 is concerned. But now, as I mean, you understand this, this is the time for me to draw your attention to section 36 when it is correlated with that. And what is section 36? It says liability of prior parties to holder in due course. This has got reference to what? The concept of holder in due course with which you are dealt. And what it said, every prior party to a negotiable instrument is liable thereon to a holder in due course until the instrument is duly satisfied. So every prior party to a negotiable instrument is liable thereon to holder in due course until the instrument is duly satisfied. And that is the reason why I told you how the liability of the parties will come to an end. So every prior party, if the amount is recovered by Mr. G from Mr. E, from Mr. D, D can recover it from Miss C accordingly. So that is, I mean, and ultimately the parties, when the liability of the party who is supposed to carry out payment, as we have dealt when we have started dealing with section 82, liability will come to an end. With this now, as far as the relationship between the parties is concerned, this is the time for me to draw your attention to section 38. And what section 38 says? Prior party. It says prior party, a principal in respect of each subsequent party. What is the relationship between prior party and subsequent party? And it says, as between the parties so liable as sureties, each party is, in the absence of a contract to the contrary, also liable thereon as the principal debtor in respect of each subsequent party. We have dealt I mean, this aspect, but this is, as we are dealing with discharge, the time for me to draw your attention under one more section, that is section 40, which says discharge of endorser's liability. And it says, where the holder of a negotiable instrument without the consent of endorser, destroys or impairs the endorser's remedy against a prior party, the endorser is discharged from liability to the holder to the same extent as if the instrument has been paid at maturity. So that is, I mean, the liability of the endorser will come. So he is discharged from liability. These are the sections to which you should have a passing reference from the point of view of understanding the chapter with which we are dealing. With this now, we start discussing now. This is the time for us to discuss section 83, which deals with discharge by allowing drawee more than 48 hours to accept. When a bill of exchange is presented for the purpose of acceptance, the time that can be given to the drawee to think over whether he is going to accept it or not is 48 hours excluding public holiday. And if that is not done, by the drawee, then the holder must treat that negotiable instrument is dishonored for non-acceptance. We dealt with the provisions regarding presentment for acceptance and presentment for payment right from section 61 up to section 78 of the Negotiable Instrument Act. So now section 83 says, if the holder of a bill of exchange allows the drawee more than 48 hours exclusive of public holidays to consider whether he will accept the same, all previous parties not consenting to such allowance are thereby discharged from liability to such holder. So all the parties here, if more time is given, so I mean it is the duty of the holder to give how many hours? 48 hours exclusive of public holidays. To whom? To the drawee, to consider whether he will accept the same. And if if the holder of the bill of exchange allows driving more than this 48 hours, all previous parties not consenting. So all he has got right to recover amount from all parties. Hence all previous parties not consenting to such allowance, if they have not given assent, are thereby discharged from liability to such holder. With this now, if you read section along with this, if you take into consideration section 86, which says parties not consenting discharged by qualified or limited acceptance. So now the instrument bill of exchange is required to be accepted as it is. There cannot be what is known as qualified acceptance. And if at all there is a qualified acceptance, then unless consent is given by the previous parties, then he has got no right to recover that amount from prior parties, and they are discharged from liability is made mention as far as section, this is one way as far as section 86 is concerned. And it says, if the holder of a bill of exchange acquiescence in a qualified acceptance, or one limited to a part of a sum mentioned in a bill, or which substitutes a different place or time for payment, or which where the drawees are not partners is not signed by all the drawees, all previous parties whose consent is not obtained. Consent of the, if there is a qualified or limited acceptance, consent of the prior parties or the parties is required. If all previous parties whose consent is not obtained to such acceptance are discharged as against the holder and those claiming under him, unless on notice given by the holder they assent to such acceptance. So if there is, and then first of all let us try to understand the explanation. It says an acceptance is qualified when it can be said that the acceptance it is a qualified. Small a says where it is conditional, declaring the payment to be dependent on the happening of an event therein stated. B, where it undertakes the payment of part only of the sum ordered to be paid. C, where no place of payment being specified on the order, it undertakes the payment at a specified place and not otherwise or elsewhere, or where a place of payment being specified in the order, it undertakes the payment at some other place and not otherwise or elsewhere. And lastly it says D, where it undertakes the payment at a time other than that at which under the order or would be legally due. So this is what is known as qualified acceptance. Qualified acceptance is no acceptance. And if in case of a qualified acceptance, holder must obtain consent all previous parties whose consent is not obtained is required to be obtained. If it is not obtained, then such acceptance, if it is not accepted, they are discharged as against the holder and those who claiming under him, unless on notice given by the holder they assent to such acceptance. So there can be qualified acceptance, no doubt about it, provided there is assent to such, otherwise the parties are discharged from liability. With this now, we proceed to section 84, which deals with, section 84 deals with when check not duly presented and drawer damaged thereby. And it says, where a check is not presented, now the check is required to be presented. I hope you remember the part of the definition with which you are dealt. Check is a bill of exchange drawn on a specified banker. So where check is not presented for payment within a reasonable time of its issue, and the drawer or person on whose account it is drawn had the right at the time when presentment ought to have been made, as between himself and the banker, to have the check paid, and suffers actual damage through the delay, he is discharged to the extent of such damage, that is to say, to the extent to which the drawer or person is a creditor of a banker to a large amount than he would have if such check had been paid. So when check is issued, that is required to be presented, and if it is, not if it check is not duly presented, which results into what? Damage to the drawer. For example, in order to understand this, if you read the illustration small a, which says A draws a check for ₹1,000, and when the check ought to be presented, has funds at the bank to meet. The bank fails before the check is presented. The drawer is discharged, but the holder can prove against the bank for the amount of the check. Now this part with which we shall be dealing, and then clause 2 and clause 3 as far as section 84 is concerned, with which we shall be dealing as we start dealing with the provisions as far as the check is concerned. With this now we come to section 85, which talks about check payable to order, and say where a check payable to order purports to be endorsed by or on behalf of the payee, the drawee is discharged by payment in due course. So when the payment is carried out by the drawee in due course, he is discharged. And then subclause 2 says where a check is originally expressed to be payable to bearer, the drawee is discharged by payment in due course to the bearer thereof, notwithstanding any endorsement, whether in full or in blank, appearing thereon, and notwithstanding that any such endorsement purports to restrict or exclude further negotiation. Now this is, when we will talk regarding check, especially crossing of the check, when we will start discussing right from section 123, there we will come across this provision as far as section in detail as far as section 85 is concerned. But as we are dealing with this chapter, let us refer to it from the point of view of proceeding further. With this now, section 85A deals with drafts drawn by one branch of bank on another payable to order, and says where any draft, that is an order. What is this? This is an order to pay money drawn by one office of a bank upon another office of the same bank for a sum of money payable to the order on demand, purposed to be endorsed by or on behalf of pay, the bank is discharged by payment in due course. So this is as far as section 85 is concerned, to which we will have reference at the time we deal with the provisions as far as the checks are concerned. With this now, we proceed to the next way in which their parties can be discharged from liability, and that is we shall start dealing right from section 87. And section 87 deals with effect of material alteration. It says any material alteration of a negotiable instrument renders the same void. So there should not be any material alteration on what on a negotiable instrument, because it renders the same void as against anyone who is a party thereto at the time of making such alteration and does not consent thereto, unless it was made in order to carry out the common intention of the original parties. So if there was to carry out the common intention of the original parties, no problem. But otherwise, material alteration results into what? Material alteration results into discharging of parties from the liabilities. And then if he has, for example, if he has changed the date of the negotiable instrument, if somebody changes the amount for which it is drawn, the place at which it is made payable, under these circumstances, this will be treated as a material which changes the entire characteristic of the negotiable instrument for when it was drawn right in the beginning, when it was passed on by the maker in favor of payee accordingly. Now alteration by endorsing, and further part says, and any such alteration, if made by an endorsee, discharges his endorser from all liability to him in respect of consideration thereof. So this is alteration by endorsee. What is the result of it? it says, and any such alteration if made by an endorsee discharges his endorser. So if it is made by endorsee, that will discharge an endorser. The relationship between endorser and endorsee, namely transferor and transferee, with which we have dealt, from all liability to him in respect of consideration thereof. The provisions of this section are subject to those of sections. So this is a time with which we have dealt with section 20. We have dealt with section 49. We have dealt with section 85 and we have dealt with section 86, and we shall be dealing with section 125. So when we shall be dealing with section 125, we will learn there can be a party who has drawn a check, may not be a cross, but the party who receives it may cross it. Then there can be what is known as, when he puts it into circulation, then the other party may have what is known as spatial crossing, may add the words not negotiable. This will not be treated as a material alteration, as in case of, for example, inchoate stamped instrument with which you are dealt. If somebody has completed the instrument as I had put it into circulation, that will not be treated. So these are the provisions where it will not be treated as a material alteration, for which you will have to refer to section 20, section 49, section 86 and section 125 of the as and when it is necessary we may refer to this, but otherwise this is what is required to be taken into consideration from the point of view of understanding material alteration. Now the next section also deals with as far as this alteration is concerned, and that is dealt by section 88, which says acceptor or endorser bound notwithstanding previous alteration. And what it says, an acceptor or endorser of a negotiable instrument is bound by his acceptance or endorsement notwithstanding any previous alteration of the instrument. So if there is previous alteration of the instrument, naturally the acceptor or endorser of a negotiable instrument is bound by his acceptance. So there was a previous alteration, and now that has been accepted, or he has received it after previous endorsement, he has received the same. Then section 88 says, an acceptor or endorser of a negotiable instrument is bound by his acceptance or endorsement notwithstanding any previous alteration of the instrument. With this now, section 89, and it deals with what? Payment of instrument on which alteration is not apparent. And says, where a promissory note, bill of exchange or check has been materially altered, there is a material alteration, but does not appear to have been so altered. It is not possible to find out that it has been materially altered, appear to have been so altered, or where a check is presented for payment which does not at the time of presentation appear to be crossed, or to have had a crossing which has been obliterated, payment thereof by a person or banker liable to pay, and paying the same according to the apparent tenor thereof at the time of payment, and otherwise in due course shall discharge, so the discharge such person or banker from all liability thereon, and such payment shall not be questioned by reason of the instrument having been altered or the check crossed. So this is with which we have been, when we will deal with the check, we will again come to this, namely we will have a reference to section 88, no doubt about it. But then if the payment is carried out, this is not applicable to check only, but this is carried out to maybe where a promissory note or bill of exchange, they are materially altered, but does not appear to have been so altered. The parties, by carrying out payment, the parties are discharged from liability. Clause 2 and clause 3 of this section deals with check as far as the definition of the check is concerned, with which you are not yet dealt. So we will have reference to this during course of our lecture when you go back to section 6 of the Negotiable Instrument Act. With this now, last section, namely section 90, deals with extinguishment of rights of action on bill in acceptor's hand. And it says, if a bill of exchange which has been negotiated is at or after maturity held by the acceptor, in his own right, all rights of action thereon are extinguished. So who is supposed to carry out payment? The acceptor is supposed to. This is what is known as negotiation back. So the party who is supposed to carry out payment during course of time gets the negotiable instrument. And especially in case of a bill of exchange which has been negotiated is at or after maturity held by the acceptor. It is, acceptor is supposed to carry out payment and it goes back to him. Then naturally now in his own right, then all rights of action thereon are extinguished, namely the parties are naturally discharged from liability as far as section 90 of the Negotiable Instrument Act is concerned. With this now, when a negotiable instrument is dishonored, maybe if it is a promissory note can be dishonored, namely either for non-acceptance or non-payment. If it is a bill of exchange, it can be dishonored either for non-acceptance or for non-payment, because we have already dealt with some part of the procedure. Yes. If it is a promissory note, it is dishonored for non-payment. If it is a check, it is dishonored for non-payment. So now, once a negotiable instrument is dishonored, namely what is required to be done on the part of the party, it is presented for the purpose of acceptance and it is not accepted. Naturally we say it is dishonored for non-acceptance, which is the provision which is applicable as far as bill of exchange is concerned. When in case of a promissory note the payment is not carried out, or in case of a check the payment is not carried out, we say the negotiable instrument, namely the promissory note and check, is dishonored for non-payment. If it is dishonored for non-payment, naturally there is some procedure, namely notice of dishonor, and is required to be followed. What is this notice of dishonor? To whom a notice of dishonor is required to be given, and how that notice of dishonor should be given are all the aspects with which we will continue our discussion right from section 91 up to section 98, and the heading of chapter 8 is notice of dishonor, with which we will continue our discussion as we proceed to next part.